Battle of Chosin Reservoir marked a prominent moment in the Korean War. During the 17 days of fierce battle amidst freezing weather, 30,000 UN command troops were surrounded by 120,000 People's Volunteer Army soldiers from China. These men were under direct orders from Mao Zedong to destroy the UN's forces. The US troops found themselves in the middle of the harshest winter recorded during the war. They were out of supplies, and their guns had frozen. Desperate for artillery, they placed their hope for survival on an artillery airdrop. But to their surprise, the one such drop contained nothing but Tootsie Rolls. The Chinese had the US 10th Corps trapped, or so they thought. However, the US would ultimately pull off a daring breakout to accomplish, quote, the greatest evacuation movement by sea in US military history. The battle has since become even more legendary, thanks to tales about how the Tootsie Rolls actually saved the US soldiers. Chinese intervention. It seemed like the Korean War would soon end to the benefit of the UN and South Korea. Key battles were going the UN's way, such as the successful landing at Incheon by the American 10th Corps, the counteroffensive to the Prussian perimeter offensive by the 8th Army, and the rapid overrunning of the North Korean People's Army. The UN forces were advancing into North Korea, hoping to set up a reunification before the end of 1950. Yet this was not without complications. The UN forces were separated into two groups in the north, due to the country being split by its central and impassable Taebaek Mountains. The 8th Army had to tread on via the western coast, while the Republic of Korea 1st Corps and the US 10th Corps took the eastern shores. On October 19th of that year, after warning the UN multiple times, the People's Republic of China entered the Korean War by sending soldiers of the People's Volunteer Army into North Korea. One of the first Chinese military units to arrive at the Chosin Reservoir was the 42nd Corps, which was assigned to halting the eastern UN advance. In response, the US 1st Marine Division of the 10th Corps landed at Wonsan on the east coast, taking the Chinese by surprise. It almost immediately started fighting the defending 124th Division of the PVA on November 2nd. By the 6th, the PVA's 42nd Corps ordered the division to retreat north towards the reservoir so that the UN forces would follow. General Douglas MacArthur ordered the 8th Army to launch its Home by Christmas offensive due to the onslaught of sudden Chinese attacks. He saw the Chinese intervention and the changing landscape of the war as, quote, one of the most offensive acts of international lawlessness of historic record. In support of this offensive, MacArthur had the 10th Corps attack from the west of the Chosin Reservoir to cut the supply line between Manpojin, Kangye, and Huichon. Major General Edward M. Almond, the commander of the 10th Corps, formulated a plan of attack on November 21st. He would have the 1st U.S. Marine Division advance west. Simultaneously, the 7th Infantry Division would protect the right flank, and the 3rd Infantry Division protected the left and rear of the formation. At that point, the 10th Corps was spread out through a thin 400-mile front. When Mao Zedong received news of the Marine landing at Wonsan, he ordered the immediate destruction of the UN forces in a message sent by telegraph. At Mao's request, the formidable PVA 9th Army was quickly sent to North Korea on November 10th, a move that went undetected by the UN forces. Unseen, they penetrated the Chosin Reservoir area on the 17th. The Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir was a sparsely populated area around an artificial lake to the northeast of Korea. In its original language, the place is actually called Shangshin, but the name Chosin, used in the West to refer to the conflict, comes from a mistaken Japanese pronunciation. The UN forces adopted it because they were using outdated Japanese maps. On the other side, official Chinese sources referred to the battle as the eastern part of the second phase campaign. The battle was fought mainly around a 78-mile road connecting the reservoir with Hongnam, which was the only retreat channel for the United Nations forces. The road had been created by cutting through hills and rough terrain with steep drops and climbs. The quality was less than ideal, and was no more than a lane of gravel at some points. As if the conditions weren't difficult enough, the coldest winter experienced during the war was on its way, freezing the reservoir area and making the terrain difficult to tread on. Further than the already lousy weather, November 14th marked the arrival of a cold front from Siberia that pulled the temperature as low as minus 38 degrees Celsius, or minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground froze solid, increasing the likelihood of frostbite, causing weapon malfunctions and leaving ice on the roads. The Army's supplies froze as well, with morphine syrettes needing defrosting, often in the medic's mouth before injection. Some medical supplies were temporarily ruined, such as blood plasma, which became useless once turned to ice. Batteries also struggled to function in the low temperature, making radios and vehicles challenging to handle. The gun lubrication froze many weapons, and the springs on the firing pins would not hit hard enough to shoot, or they would jam. The Tootsie Roll drop. The 30,000 soldiers committed by the US 10th Corps and the UN forces were under intense stress and facing an uphill battle when 120,000 Chinese soldiers launched their attack at the Chosin Reservoir. The Corps, commandeered by Major General Edward Almond, was freezing and in desperate need of supplies. The UN forces, headed by Major Oliver P. Smith, were facing an equally dire situation and in need of more bullets. Badly outnumbered, the coalition forces had earned the nickname, quote, the Chosen Few. The coalition submitted an airdrop request with the codename Tootsie Rolls, which would deliver artillery necessary for their survival. They were shocked to discover that the packages actually contained nothing more than actual Tootsie Rolls. However, the candy ended up being extremely useful. When frozen, the Tootsie Rolls could be used to patch bullet holes and fix their equipment. The sugar also jolted the starving troops. Milton Walker, who drove a communications equipment jeep, would later recall the incident, stating, quote, "That was what most of us survived on for food for the 3 weeks." With the vehicles repaired, the US and UN forces were able to attempt a breakout from the Chinese encirclement. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir. At nightfall on November 27th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army conducted attacks and ambushes along the road from Kotori and Chosin. The Marines defending at Udam-ni were surrounded and attacked by the Chinese as well. One of the PVA divisions struck the road between Hagaru-ri and Udam-ni, cutting off the line of communication between the forces at the two areas. Caught by surprise, the UN forces were utterly isolated. As the battle raged in freezing conditions at Udam-ni, the People's Volunteer Army attacked the two companies defending the road, Fox and Charlie. Thanks to the success of the aggressive assault, the Charlie Company retreated. Captain William E. Barber's Fox Company was left standing alone on an isolated hill that looked over Toktung Pass. This vital section would cement either side's control of the road. The Marines launched several failed efforts to rescue the Fox Company, putting a significant dent in the Chinese forces. However, ultimately, Captain William E. Barber's company was left to deal with the situation by themselves. Fox Company managed to hold the position for 5 days with artillery support from Hagaru-ri and a few Marine Corsair F-4U fighter planes that dropped napalm. They were under constant attack by the Chinese. The Chinese belatedly realized that the bulk of the UN forces were stationed at Udam-ni and that their garrison was twice as strong as they had previously believed. Because of this, Song Shi-lun considered all further attacks pointless and ordered his 9th Army to redirect its primary efforts towards Hagaru-ri and Sinhung-ni. The forces at Udam-ni got some rest between November 28th and 30th. On the Western Korean front, the US 8th Army was forced to fully retreat from the Battle of the Chungcheon River, which started with surprise attacks on November 25th. The PVA successfully struck the 8th Army's right flank, which allowed them to position themselves at the UN forces' rear. MacArthur ordered the withdrawal of the US 10th Corps to the port of Hongnam. In response, Lieutenant Raymond L. Murray and Colonel Homer L. Litzenberg issued an order requiring the troops to break out from Udam-ni to Hagaru-ri on the 30th. General Oliver P. Smith reportedly stated at the time, quote, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." To retreat, the Marines assembled a convoy led by a single M4A3 Sherman tank. They conducted their attack in the direction of Fox Company, still stranded by itself, so that they could all march through the road at Toktung Pass. On December 1st, the Marines engaged the People's Volunteer Army again, with the Marines forced to dig in on slopes between peaks and trails to attack the Chinese defenders. The PVA returned attacks on Udam-ni as one of their divisions headed for Kotori. The PVA struck at night with such force that night fighter planes had to be called in to cover their rear forces and fend off the attacks. The fighting continued until dawn on the 2nd. It only truly stopped once all the Marines had withdrawn from the area. By then, the Chinese forces were considerably diminished at Udam-ni and Hagaru-ri. Song Shi-lun ordered his troops at Kotori and Hongnam to dig in near Funchilin Pass to destroy an essential treadway bridge. They hoped this obstacle would allow the remaining PVA forces to reunite and catch up to the retreating UN forces. To overcome the problem of the destroyed passage, the US 314th Troop Carrier Wing provided 8 C-119 flying boxcars to drop portable bridge sections by parachute. The United Nations forces finally arrived at the Hongnam evacuation perimeter on the night of December 11th. The Hongnam evacuation. By the time the UN forces arrived at the port city of Hongnam, General Douglas MacArthur had already given the evacuation order for the US 10th Corps. Subsequently, the US would conduct an evacuation deemed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, in US military history, sometimes called, quote, the Christmas Miracle. 193 ships arrived at the port to carry away coalition troops, their heavy equipment, and about a third of the Korean refugees in the area. One of the involved vessels, the SS Meredith Victory, was only assigned to carry 12 people, but left the port with 14,000 refugees on board. After the last United Nations unit departed on December 24th, the port was destroyed so the Chinese couldn't use it. The People's Volunteer Army entered Hongnam the following morning, signaling a new phase in the Korean War.